Rabbi, are you on mute?
Hello. Hi, how are you,
Hello.
kids? Thank you. Hi, Peter. Okay, I think we're going to get started in a minute. Let's get the page set up. It's a relatively short chapter, so should get through it quite quickly. Okay, it is 1 o'clock. I'm going to share the screen. Jeff.
Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon. We'll get started, and I guess those that join will join when they make it. So the laws of Tumat Tzaraat, the Tumah associated with this Tzaraat, as we assume would have been mentioned yesterday, right? And the Rambam will clarify this later in the laws. Tzaraat, although often translated as leprosy, because the description of the physical symptoms is similar to that of leprosy, we know that essentially it's an ailment that was indicative of some type of spiritual malady. So it's a spiritual disease, as it were, manifests in the physical, and it, when confirmed, brings on impurity. Okay, and that's the association with the broader halachot that we've been learning. So yesterday we mentioned that there are three components to the tzaraat that would determine it as absolute tzaraat, right? We learned that there are times when someone would have to isolate until you can confirm whether or not it's tzaraat. But if you've got the discoloration, we gave different 4 shades of white, plus the growth of 2 white hairs, and in addition to that, either a healthy skin in the midst of this white or the white starts to expand, those 3 things would determine the tzaraat to be the full ailment, and thus tumah, right? The person would then be called a mitzara. So we're going to focus today on those hairs that may appear within the midst of that skin discoloration. And when is it considered an absolute indication that this is tzaraat? And when is it just a warning which would require isolation and follow-up? So here we go. Tumat Tzaraat, chapter 2. The white hair that is a sign of impurity for tzaraat is not less than 2 hairs. So within the white patch, there must be 2 white hairs. How long must they be? Long enough to be pulled out by a tweezer. So it has to, in other words, how long is that? Well, it's going to basically, has to at the very least be emerging somewhat from the skin. If one was long and the other was short, in other words, if there were only 2 hairs and one was long and the other was shorter than this measure, or one was black and one was white, or one was whole below but split in 2 above, and so it appears as 2, or at its base it was black but at the top was white, in all those situations, the person is pure. It's not an indication of impurity at all. If its base was white and its top dark, even though only the slightest amount was white, he is impure. Because as we'll see, and we'll repeat this verse soon, is that it says that the hair emerges from the nega, from the illness. So if at the point where it emerges, meaning at the root, it's white, even if at the top it gets black, it would be considered a white hair for the determination of this impurity. Halacha 2. When there are 2 white hairs in a blemish, even though there is a black hair between them and they are scattered, meaning they're not 2 hairs next to each other, there's a black in between, one in this portion, one in the other portion, they serve as a sign of impurity. Okay, so even if there's another hair there, and he says this is true even if the blemish was exactly the size of a gris. Remember yesterday we said the size has to be this gris, some type of bean, barley or something. It's that size. So now, as you're saying, if the entire discoloration was just that size, which means that the black hair that's in it is diminishing minimally that space, he says, nonetheless, it would still be impure. The space of the black hair does not reduce its size. Now, whether the two hairs are in the midst of the baheret and it surrounds them, or they're at its edge, the person is impure, as long as it's within the discoloration. If, however, they are at its side, outside of it, so even though it's very close, but it's outside of the discoloration, he is pure. The skin from which the two white hairs grow must be white in order to impart impurity. As he's emphasizing, there's got to be on the skin where the discoloration is. So within it, even if it's not literally in the center of it, it could be on its edges, and they could be distant from each other, and they can either be another hair inside there that's a different color. But if it's in and it's growing out of the discolored skin and they're both white, it would be impure. Anything less than that, it's not impure. If the two hairs originate in the midst of the blemish, but lie out of it, he is impure. So if the hair kind of grows at an angle outwards, right? If it originates outside of it, but lie within it, then it's not a sign of impurity. Okay, so it's where the root is. This goes back to what the verse says. It grows out of the nega. So as long as where it's growing out of is in the white discolored skin, and it itself is white, and there's two of them, it would be impure. Anything less than that, not impure. Any shade of whiteness, halacha 3, in the hair causes the person to be deemed impure, whether they are white as snow or very weak shade of whiteness. Since they appear white, he is impure. Unlike the discoloration of the skin, which we discussed 3 or 4 shades of, and only those shades would make one impure. When it comes to hair, it's any shade of white. Halacha 4, white hair is not a sign of impurity unless it is inside the baheret itself. Okay, just confirming what we said previously. What's implied? So he's going to give us like exceptions. If there is a baheret and in the midst there is a boil, burned skin, a bohak, which is a discoloration that does not fit one of the shades of white, which would make one a mitzvah, or he has a boil that has healed or a burn that is healed, and there are two white hairs in the boil, the burnt flesh, or the bohak that's in the midst of the blemish. So you've got a discoloration of the skin. In the midst of the discoloration of the skin, you've got another type of one of these things, a boil or a burn or something, and then the hair grows out of that. So he says, this is not a sign of impurity. It is like a baheret that does not have white hair, in which instance the person should be isolated. This ruling is rendered even though the baheret surrounds the boil, or the burnt flesh, or the healed boiled, or the burnt flesh, or the bark in which the two hairs are located. So even though it's like right in the middle of it, but if it's growing out of one of these other things, it's not yet considered impure. And the person would be isolated. Similarly, if the boil, the burnt flesh, the healed boil or burnt flesh, or the bark surrounded the two hairs, they are not a sign of impurity. The baheret is like a baheret; it does not have white hair, and the person should be isolated. If I understand correctly, the last point in halacha that the Rambam is saying, in the first one, the boil itself is actually emerging from the discolored white skin. The second scenario, I think what the Rambam is talking about, is when you have the boil, and then immediately surrounding it, you've got the discolored skin. And then the hair's growing. He's saying it's kind of obvious, but he's emphasizing the point that so long as it's not growing actually out of the white hair, out of the discolored white skin, this is not considered impure. Halacha 5, now this is interesting. If the boil, the bohak, right, again, as bohak is a part of a discoloration that's not one of the shades, which is tameh, or the burnt flesh that's surrounded are next to or divide the white hairs. Okay, so you've got it. Now, if that disappears, and that's the two hairs are found within the baheret itself. So if this is at the end of the first week or at the end of the second week of isolation period, either way, right? So, in the first instance, if it's growing out of the bark, they would have to be isolated, but it's not for sure impure. Now they come out and that boil has disappeared. So it's disappeared now. Now he says, and now the hairs are actually present in just the baheret, in the skin discoloration that is impure. So he says the person then is declared definitely impure. Okay. If these abnormal skin features do not disappear, he should be released from the process of inspection. So as nothing happened and it just remained there, then it's no longer a question of impurity. Halacha 6, white hair is not a sign of impurity unless the baheret precedes the white hair. Right? This can be inferred from the verse, and it turned hair to white. So as if a person has white hair and then he starts to get a white skin coloration, you say, oh, there's a whole bunch of white hairs there. No. It has to be that the baheret showed up first, and then either hair grew and it was white, or the hair that was there, which was previously a different color, turned white. So the Baheret caused it to turn white. If the white hair exists before the Baheret, it is like a Baheret that does not have a sign, and the person should be isolated. Again, you would be isolated because now that you've got to wait a week, and then you'll check: did other hair grow? Did it expand? Did healthy skin appear? Which would be the other things you would look out for it to be determined as absolute tumah. Halacha 7. Following rule applies when a person had a Baheret which contained white hair, which caused him to be deemed definitely impure, and afterwards the Baheret disappeared and left the white hairs in its place. So he was determined as a Metzora, but the hairs now remain and the Baheret has cleared up. Then afterwards another Baheret returned to that place where the first Baheret was, and now you have the two hairs there. In other words, those hairs grew in a place where they confirmed impurity. But then the base of that impurity disappeared, the Baheret disappeared, and the hairs remained there. And now a new Baheret appeared. So the Rambam tells us, even in that case, he says this is called so-called entrusted hairs. And even in this case, it is not a sign of impurity. Now, as although it was a sign of impurity for the original Baheret. Why? Because when the verse says, and it turned the hair to white, implies that the Baheret in question must be the cause of the color of the hair turning to white. But if it became white from another Baheret, it does not combine with the new Baheret to make the person impure. Halacha 8. Following rule applies if a person has a Baheret the size of a grist. It contains two white hairs, and thereafter he was deemed definitely impure. Okay, which makes sense. Then a portion, half the size of a grist, disappeared, and he was deemed pure. Right? The Kohen looked at him, came back out. And then the two hairs were located in a portion half the size of a grist that remained. And afterwards, a half a grist returned to the place where the half that disappeared was. In other words, in the previous halacha, we said that the Baheret completely disappeared. In this halacha, what we're saying is that only half of it disappeared. The white hairs remained in the Baheret, and now another half grist appeared. And now, in effect, what you have is a full Baheret with two hairs, but it had originally been less. So what does he say? Thus, there were two white hairs in a Baheret the size of a grist. He says, still, this is not considered a sign of impurity. For one entire Baheret must cause the color of the two hairs to change. It must be the entire Baheret that causes it to change. So if you've got now a combined Baheret, that's not good enough to make the person tamei, because we know that originally, it had been cleared, and then another amount of skin, half the size of a grist, changed color, and that's not enough to make the person tamei. Okay, there's all quite a lot of detail here, but I hope it's making sense. He's really emphasizing what we learned from the pasuk is that the white hairs must grow out of the actual Baheret in question, right? And it must be there. So, and all these other scenarios where it's not exactly like that, it's the person, he's not tamei. Okay, halacha 9, this is the final halacha. He says when a person had a Baheret that was half the size of a grist, without any white hair inside of it, and then another Baheret that was half the size of a grist, which contained one white hair erupted at its side, the person should be isolated. Okay? If a person had a Baheret that was, but it's not absolute yet, right? Until he comes back and two new hairs grow. If a person had a Baheret that was half the size of a grist with one white hair inside of it, and then another Baheret that was half the size of a grist, which contained one white hair erupted at its size, the person should be isolated. Again, it's not absolute impurity, because each one was only half of what was necessary. Now combined, you would still need the further verification that it's actually tamei or otherwise. When a person has a Baheret that was half the size of a grist without any white hair inside of it, and then another Baheret that was half the size of a grist, which contained two white hair erupted at its side, the person should be deemed definitely impure. Because now you do have two hairs coming out of a combined space that is impure. The rationale is that a Baheret preceded the two white hairs. Although it started off as a half a Baheret, and then it got a second Baheret, but now together the two hairs grew out of it, and you got two hairs growing out of the combined space, that would be impure. Now, he says, when there's a doubt whether the white hair came first or the Baheret came first, so the two combined, and now you see the white hairs, but you're not sure. Did the hair come before they combined or not? So he says, then the person would be deemed impure. The Rambam ever says, it appears to me that this impurity is of a questionable nature. So in other words, it's a doubtful situation, but it's a doubt with regard to a biblical definition. And therefore we err on the side of caution, as it were. We treat them as impure, even though he says there is an overlaying doubt in this on that scenario. Okay, so let's go to the quiz. First question: in which of the following cases is one not impure with tzaraat? What are the cases? One, when the hairs are white at the bottom but black at the top. When one hair is white and one hair is black. When there are two white hairs with black hairs in between them. Which one is not impure? Number two, correct, right? Because the others would still deem the person impure. If one had two white hairs grow out from a boil that was in the middle of a baheret, and then the boil went away, is the person impure? Anyone want to venture?
No, that's a guess.
I must be honest, I had to double check this one. The answer is yes. We learned in our halacha 4 that if it's growing out of it, it doesn't make it impure. But if it heals, remember, he's also saying if it's healed, and now the two hairs are in the baheret, he would be impure. Okay? Which needs to come first? A person to be impure? Sorry. Which needs to come first for a person to be impure? The baheret or the two white hairs?
The baheret.
The baheret, right? And that's one of the principles that's really this chapter is based on, that verse, that it's got to emerge from the nega itself, as the pasuk says. Final question: if a baheret with a white hair made one impure, and then the baheret went away, and a new one returned in its place, does it make one impure again? Sorry,
No.
I didn't understand what I was reading. But I'm going to go with what you said. Correct. Actually, I was reading the question. I didn't understand what I read. Okay, anyway. I'm glad you heard the question. I'm glad you got it right.
Just let me check.
Okay, start.
Thanks,
Sorry, I joined very late. Sorry.
No worries. Glad you made it. Okay. Lovely to see you around. Have a beautiful
Thank
day.
you.
See you next week.